it seems that we're either going to end up with an omnibus package or a continuing resolution and kick the can down the road once again. Are either of those things fiscally responsible?
Well, it depends what they include in them, whether they're fiscally responsible or not. But both of them are 100% a reflection of the fact that our budget process is beyond broken. We should have passed a budget. We're well into the fiscal year, and we should have passed a budget last spring, let alone by the end of the year and the end of September. So no, the fact that we're even considering the two of these is just a sign that we don't budget the right way at all, and we're not dealing with these big issues. And there's still a very large risk, no matter which they choose, a CR and omnibus, that they are going to fill it with additional debt-financed policies. And that's where a big risk is for the end of this year.
Well, so then as we look ahead to next year and what's going to happen with the budget and debt, obviously we've gotten a ton of names dropped from Donald Trump in the last few days, including Russell Vought reprising his role as OMB director. And I wonder what that makes you think, Maya, about the way the budget process is going to play out in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, so Vought has been there before. We've seen where his priorities are. He's looking very closely at some of the roles that the executive agency can have. But what we did see when he was the director of OMB before is that it was a period, not even counting COVID, but when spending grew very, very significantly. One of the things to remember about the last Trump administration was that there was obviously an emphasis on large tax cuts where they passed the TCJA, that added to the debt. But right after that, there were huge spending increases to about the tune of $2 trillion. And so one of the things we've seen is that there hasn't been a big emphasis on cutting spending. In fact, under President Trump before, spending went up significantly. The big question mark is whether they will focus more on spending cuts this time around, because clearly the spending is on an unsustainable path, as is the national debt.
Well, and presumably the Secretary of the Treasury is going to have a role in this as well, Maya. He has tapped Scott Bessent, who has talked a lot about this kind of 3-3-3 policy strategy. Two of those threes relating to the deficit in some way or another, as we consider the fact that he wants to see 3% GDP growth, yes, which he thinks tax cuts will inspire. But he also wants to cut the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP to 3%. Can he get both a permanent 2017 tax cut package and a lower debt to GDP? Can he have both of those things?
He can get certainly a higher level of growth and lower deficit. That 3-3-3 plan, it sounds great. It's very, very tough to get to those numbers. But just moving in that direction would be huge amounts of progress. The real question here is whether they are going to insist that the tax cuts are offset. If you just add them to the debt and you add the $3.9 trillion or more, not only is that going to make 3% deficits impossible, which it's already going to be very hard to achieve, it's going to add to the effects, the headwinds against growth. So tax cuts help grow the economy. Higher levels of debt harm economic growth. So the best way to grow the economy is if you want to cut taxes to make sure it's not adding to the debt, it's not debt finance, but it's offset either through base broadening or spending cuts. The future Secretary of the Treasury has talked about this and written about this. He is somebody who does care about fiscal responsibility an awful lot. So I think that he will be one of the voices pushing for that, but it will also depend where else the other voices in the administration are. And there is a big propensity among lawmakers, particularly when it's just one political party that has all the branches of government. There's a strong desire not to do anything hard and just to borrow everything. If they borrow for those tax cuts, the deficit will go up and economic growth will go up in the short term, but not the long term. It will go down in the long term because it'll be more depressed from the debt levels.
Well, what they would tell you, Maya, is it's not just that they borrow. They're also going to offset the lost revenue through higher tariffs. But there's a question about the economic impact of that as well. Obviously, in the earlier edition of Balance of Power, I spoke with Seth Harris.
The likeliest consequence of the tariffs will be much higher prices for Americans, for consumers, not merely with respect to imported products, but also domestic products. The prices will go up because American producers won't have to keep their prices low. And also, I think a lot of people are going to lose their jobs.
So,
Yeah.
Maya, feel free to weigh in on that economic impact, but then also to what extent tariffs, even for that, would be able to offset the lost revenue for the Treasury.
Yeah, great point. I mean, I find tariffs really interesting because there's so many different effects they have. The economics of tariffs is not good. It slows economic growth. It does increase prices. We don't know if that will be a one-off or it will contribute to igniting inflation again, but we know it will push prices up. The fiscal effects, however, can be quite positive. Even though it has a negative effect on the economy, you're still likely to raise revenues. It depends how other countries respond, but you're likely to raise revenues. We estimate that you could raise between 2 and 3 trillion reasonably from tariffs. That would not offset all of the tax cuts, but it would offset a good deal of them. And then there's also the final consideration of what's the national security effect. They're not put in place just for economic reasons. They're for national security reasons. But tariffs would not be the most pro-growth way to raise revenue for sure, but they could take away some of the bite of adding to the national debt if you don't do anything to offset them. I can promise you one thing, there's going to be a huge fight on these tariffs, very different economic perspectives, even from within the cabinet as it's becoming appointed.
Well, and the appointed members of the cabinet and the role that they will have in the typical structure of the U.S. government is one consideration here, Maya. The others are, of course, people who are going to have kind of adjacent roles, like, say, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who will be leading this Department of Government Efficiency. And weigh in, if you like, on the overlap between the DOGE work and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budgets work, how much they're going to be working on the same things you are. But you obviously have much more experience operating in Washington than either of those two do. And I wonder what realistically you think they'll be able to accomplish.
Well, I'm actually going to say that the fact that they don't have experience working in Washington may be to their benefit. I mean, part of what we need to do clearly there is a need for the mission that they have. We need to look at our federal government. We need to squeeze out efficiencies wherever we can find them, and there are plenty of places we can. We need to cut spending. We need to bring in technology in ways that will help make us more efficient in our agencies and our departments. We need to create systems where our computers from one agency to another can actually talk to each other. So in that way, I think it's terrific that they haven't been doing the same baseline scoring that I think about and other people think about all the time. On the other hand, there's another sort of related entity that I thought you were going to ask about, but it's Congress. And Congress is going to have to approve a lot of these savings. And when they look at things like unauthorized spending, and yes, there's $500 billion in unauthorized spending, but a lot of this comes from the fact that there's huge bipartisan commitment within Congress for those programs. And so it just goes through the budget process in a different way. It's not necessarily the low-hanging fruit. We're going to try to put out as many ideas as possible for this committee to use spending cuts, efficiencies, ways to broaden the tax base and get rid of some of the spending through the tax code. They're going to come up with ideas we would never think of. I hope that this is a serious exercise, and I hope people go into it with an openness that we could really improve our federal budget from these kinds of changes. But nobody should trick themselves into thinking it's going to be easy. I guess that's why I always end on all of these things, right? Fiscal responsibility is not about free lunches. It's about choices. And we're going to have to make some tough choices on revenues, on extending policies, on spending reductions, on how we use regulations in our budget. And hopefully they will bear fruit, because our fiscal situation really needs a change and improvement. So I wish them success.